This is Romans 13, 1 through 7. And what I want to talk about this morning is how Christians are supposed to relate to government. Okay? Now, this is one of those passages, I actually think it's really important, but it is most of you are not like, oh man, I'm so excited that I came to church to hear about government this morning. This is a passage where it is very easy for our eyes to glaze over and our ears to turn off. After all, I'd be willing to bet that most of us aren't into politics, but neither was the early church. Think about this for just a second. The first century Christian converts, do you remember who they were largely? The poor, women, slaves. Did any of those groups have political power? No. So they probably weren't into politics. They were probably on the receiving end of everybody else's political decisions. And yet Paul, as he is teaching the church about how to have and how to form Christian community, in other words, how do we relate to each other? Paul actually says, let me tell you something really important. And he pauses and he said, let's talk about how you relate to government. In other words, how you relate to government, I think, is connected to how we relate to one another. And that's a really important topic if it's true. So what I want to try to do is unpack this today a little bit. And there is so much stuff here. So I'm gonna try to talk about it. And if you have questions, feel free to chime in, to ask. But listen, Paul is clearly... How many of you guys have heard this passage before? Raise your hand. Okay, so some of you heard. Is there anybody who's never heard it? Okay, you've never heard it? All right. Paul is clearly talking about government. Okay, specifically in this case it would be the Roman government. But we know that. He says, look at verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Look down at verse 4. They don't bear the sword in vain. He's talking about judicial authority. Look at verse 7. Pay what is due. Taxes, you could say the second word revenues, you could say tariffs. Okay, taxes, tariffs, respect, honor. And what's important here, he's not simply saying this to the church in Rome. In other words, this isn't just like, oh, I'm writing to the church in Rome, and because that's the capital, you guys have to be particularly aware of how you relate to the governing authorities. Listen to this. Peter says something very, very similar. This is in 1 Peter 1. You can flip over there if you want. I'll read it to you. Peter is not writing to Roman church particular. He's writing to exiles scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. In other words, this is just to all Christians. Listen to how similar what Peter says to just Christians scattered everywhere. He says, I want you to be subject, same word, for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, the emperor, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So you need to live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. So honor everyone. Love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Okay? What'd you say? 1 Peter 2. Verses 13 through 17. So it's really important. If you said, what two passages in the scriptures are most explicit about how we're supposed to relate to the government? It's this one, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2. You should really read those together. Okay? What I want to give you today is kind of an overarching, here's some basic points that I want you to keep in mind as you go back and read and think about this, all right? I think both Paul and Peter are saying that your attitude towards government, if you're a Christian, actually, let me say it broader than this. Even if you're not a Christian, your attitude towards government will shape the kind of community that you create. And everybody is creating community, even if they're aware of it or not. In other words, you know what kind of community a lot of people are creating? What most people are creating? It's the community of me, myself, and I. So if you're thinking, in other words, if your attitude towards government, if you think the government is just there to serve your needs, you're going to carry that thinking into your community building, which is community of me, myself, and I. And you're going to expect other people to meet your needs as well. All right? So I think Paul is saying if we're trying to form Christian community, which is what a church is trying to do, we need to be thoughtful and aware of what our views towards government are. So 3 things that we want to talk about today to kind of paint a big picture. What's your attitude towards government? What's your attitude towards authority? What's your attitude towards work? In other words, how do you think about civil government? How do you think about authority more in general? And then how do you think about work? And by that I mean what you're working for. Okay? But first of all, before we jump into those things, so government, authority, work, those are our 3 points. I want to remind you of the context, because some of you haven't been here for a while, or maybe you've never been here. Let me give you the context of Romans, okay? It's always really, really important to remember what's the big story. So listen, in a nutshell, here's the story of Romans. Here's what Paul is driving at. Number 1, from Romans chapter 1, the thing that God wants most from his people is for you to learn to read, to pray, to hear his voice, and then to respond in faith. My righteous ones will live by faith, Romans 1:17. In other words, God's people, one of the defining marks is that they actually don't just read and pray and hear his voice, they respond in faith. They live by faith. So that's the first part of Romans. Now, what comes next is kind of this big question over a couple of chapters. How do people come to faith? Because everybody's a mess. Okay? No one righteous, not even one. And the answer is the way people come to faith is God. God does everything. God chooses. God can soften hearts. God can harden hearts. God does everything. When somebody believes in God and in Jesus, Paul and I think Peter would both say, even that, your faith is a gift from God. You did not produce that. Okay? And so the second big takeaway is God wants you to live by faith. That's the first thing. But the second thing is God does everything. He is completely in control, and the word that we used is sovereignty. Okay? So sovereignty. Now, as soon as you start talking about God being in absolute control, the question everybody asks is, well, what about people? Are we robots? What about freedom? And Paul's answer to that is that you're not robots, but that human beings actually, now listen, you have what we call limited sovereignty. In other words, you actually have a lot of capacity and power over your life. You decided this morning to get up and come here. You decide on Monday morning to get up and go to work. You can decide to apply for a new job. You can do lots of things. You have agency. So think about this. God wants you to live by faith. He's in complete control, but he's created you to have incredible agency. Okay, and then as we get into Romans 12, this is when everything pivots and he starts saying, now let's look at what Christian community that flows out of this faith, sovereignty, but agency, what kind of community does that create? And he starts showing us what you see in the first 3 verses of Romans chapter 12, transformation. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And it actually doesn't just renew you mentally, you start living sacrificially. And then the next 5 verses, 3 through 8, you start seeing life differently. You see yourself soberly, okay, but you look at others, I'm going to make up a word here, servantly. You actually go, oh, God has given me gifts to serve other people. Radically different view of self and of others. Realistic view of self, and then you start looking around at people around you and go, I am here to serve. And then 9 through 21, which was last week, it's all about what does it look like to love? What does real love look like? And there's a whole bunch of commands, okay? Now listen, then you get to Romans 13, to government, and all of a sudden you should be going, what? Wait a second. Why did we just jump to here? It feels out of the blue. I don't think it is, though. Think about this. So we're going to start talking about what's your attitude towards government. Anybody who starts taking these things seriously that we've been talking about, I need to live by faith. God is in complete control. He is setting out to redeem this world, but he's given me agency, and I am called to try to recreate society starting right here with church. Well, listen, if you get serious about that and you turn on the news and you look at how the secular government is running things, you know what you're going to conclude? This is terrible. These guys don't know what they're doing. And you, if you really believe that God has called you to try to change society, you know what you're going to be very tempted to do? Change the government. You know what? This world would be a lot better if we just ran it. Don't you think? Probably not. Okay? He is writing to this Roman church that is living in this really secular, pluralistic, power-oriented culture. And he is actually saying you need to have an attitude that is radically different from what the culture has. Okay? And that's what I want to talk about in this first one. What's the attitude that we're supposed to have? There's 2 kind of typical responses to government. And you see this in our culture. One is people are like, this is terrible, and they're tempted to take control. Regime change. Okay? Now, if you actually get regime change, what you usually find is not much changes. Okay? You get a new regime in and it's like, these guys are terrible too. So one of the other things that you see is after people have tried or hoped for regime change several times, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they start to just they despair, okay? They basically give up on any change. So those are 2 common responses. One is, we need regime change, and the other is, it's never going to change. And I think Paul is saying both of those responses are misguided. Now, what I want to do is walk you through a set of questions here. So first of all, I want you to pause and just think, what is your attitude towards government? You don't need to answer this. But I want you to think about it. What is my answer? Am I more of that regime change? Or am I more of I've given up on change? Second, I think that Paul is going to say that your attitude, whatever it is, actually shapes how you form community. So just hold that for a second. Now let me give you a couple examples, and I want to think specifically about the church here. So I'm just kind of focusing in and saying, let's focus on our own house, okay? In other words, I'm not going to try to speak about other communities. Let's just focus on Christian community for a second. And I'm specifically going to focus on American Christian community, American church. I see 3 kind of broad responses to government. One of them, how many of you guys, this is a relatively new thing, but maybe you've heard about it. This is probably in the last 10 years, it has really come to the front. It's called Christian nationalism. Do you know what that is? Okay, if you don't know what it is, I'm going to summarize it really broad brushstroke. It's the idea that, America's a Christian nation, ought to support and enforce Christianity. Okay? There are a lot of people in the American church saying that right now. And it tends to lean in a really kind of conservative direction politically. All right. Now, there's another, so Christian nationalism, that's kind of one response. There's a second kind of response, which has actually been around for probably a good 100 plus years, okay, which I would call it Christian liberalism. But it's more of, maybe you could call it, this is what you're hearing, this is another word that's new, that's been used in the last 10 years a lot, woke, okay? There are some Christian churches that lean in, let's just, whether you like it or not, let's call it a woke direction. They would actually say that Christianity is about compassion and tolerance, and therefore the American government should be promoting that. Now, do you hear the difference? One is saying America was founded on Christianity, support the religion. The other is saying the religion is about compassion and tolerance, support that. Now, those are similar responses, but in completely opposite directions. And then there's a third response, which I would say probably covers most of American Christianity. And I'm going to call this, for lack of a better term, Christian libertarianism. And what I mean by that is, these are the people that are just politically exhausted. They're tired of the left, they're tired of the right. They really just want government to leave us the hell alone so we can do our thing. They're pretty checked out of anything politically. So those three responses, there's kind of a right direction, what I'm calling Christian nationalism, a left direction that I'm calling Christian liberalism or woke, Christian wokeism, whatever, and then there's Christian libertarianism, which is I'm just tired, let's not talk about politics. Okay, now listen. That covers a pretty good swath of the American church right there. Okay, what are the attitudes behind each of those? I just want you to think through this for a second, because there's some different attitudes. Okay, first of all, the first two, both the Christian nationalism and the Christian woke liberalism, whatever you want to call it, actually have an aggressive view towards government. They think the government should actually drive, promote, and either push Christian policy or push Christian values, however they define it. Okay? In other words, but it's active. They look at the government and go, this is the attitude, the government should do this, and what do they want? They want to be in the driver's seat. They want their party, their views to be the dominant views because the government makes them the dominant views and ensures that they stay the dominant views. Favors those views, privileges those views. It's a very active, aggressive view towards government. The government is here to support and implement our views. Now listen, the third one, what I'm calling Christian exhausted libertarianism, is much more passive towards government because they're exhaustified. All right? And they're basically going, nothing's ever going to change. Now let's think about what kind of communities those three different views produce. For now, I just want to point out that if you went to churches, the way I've described it, can you imagine, I don't know if you know, a Christian nationalism kind of church, but you can probably imagine here in Austin some what I would call Christian woke liberalism kind of church. And you can probably imagine just this non-political, exhaustified kind of church. And the first thing I want to point out is all three of those churches would probably tend to have very different community cultures. And you wouldn't see people moving from say a Christian national church into a Christian woke liberalism church, or somebody moving from an exhaustified church into either one of those other two. They tend to have different cultures. Okay? Now, the key question, what does Paul and Peter think our attitude towards government should be? And the answer is be subject. Be submissive. That's what he says here. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. That's the exact same word that Peter used in 1 Peter. It's the same word that Paul uses in Ephesians. Okay? Wives, submit to your husbands. All right? It's the exact same word. Now, there's something interesting about Ephesians. Right after he says, wives, submit to your husbands in Ephesians 5, he also says right before that, be submitting to each other. Okay? So it's not just like a gender thing. But he also talks about slaves and masters, and he talks about children and parents, and Paul uses a different word there. Do you know what word he uses? Obey. Children, obey your parents. Slaves, obey your masters. Okay? Now, Peter, there's other places where they kind of substitute that submit word back in. So the words are related. But it's really important, I just want to say this. When you see this, he is not calling for blind obedience to the government. Do you hear that? Okay. But he is calling for something that looks like submission, whatever that is. And if you said, what does that word mean? I don't think any of those three examples that I just gave, Christian nationalism is not being submissive towards government. Christian woke liberalism is not being submissive towards government. They're submissive towards certain government. If our party's in control, we're very submissive to that. But what Paul is talking about here, when he says submit, he's talking submit to any government. Whoever's in charge. In other words, when the Republicans are in charge, guess what? You submit to them. When the Democrats are in charge, you submit to them. Okay? It's both. Were you going to ask a question?
Yeah. Do you think, like, in this time, there was, like, lots of factions and, like, people who were trying to actively overthrow the Roman government?
Well, they're all, okay, listen.
Always.
Everything, there's one thing I want to say about the Roman government. It's easy to think, well, Paul doesn't know what it was like. And Paul would say, no.
He's in jail. The Roman government has him in jail.
He's in jail. Okay.
Also, chapter 12, the verse right before be subject is, do not overcome evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every person be
subject.
So, okay.
Guys, the Roman Empire was brutally repressive. Like, if you think our political system is bad today, like we're just about to hit our 250th, I know there is a lot, but like if you listen to me preach, you're probably like, Christian's pretty critical of America. And I am in a lot of ways. But America is still a really great place. This is by far, as messed up as we are, this is probably one of the best places to live and to work and to try to learn how to read and pray and follow Jesus. You have so much opportunity. You have so much freedom and liberty. For the most part, we really do get left alone. Like Paul and the early Christians would look at this and go like, this is amazing. And they'd look at both of our political parties and they'd be like, man, you guys have it good compared to the Roman emperors. And the politics and the brutality and the corruption.
I mean, even China. Joe actually just sent me a text with a link that the church that he helped plant in China got invaded.
Yeah.
And they got arrested.
Also, the majority of the Roman Empire were not free citizens.
Yes.
Like, less than probably 10% of the actual Roman people. One were of Roman birth, like ethnically, and the majority of them were either enslaved, oppressed, or conquered, and they had no rights.
Something like 30+% of the Roman Empire were slaves. Okay. 30 to 40, depending on your time period. And they had no rights, literally. So it's really important as we hear Paul saying this to realize he was saying this to a group of people that literally were in a far more oppressive, like in other words, he would say this to Chinese Christians, he said it to Roman Christians, he says it to American Christians. He says, I actually want you to submit to whoever is control. And the word that I would use to describe this attitude is the attitude of a public servant. Okay? Which says, I'm here to support you. So let me give you some examples. Taxes, happy to pay them. Is that your attitude towards taxes? Okay. Tariffs, listen, if you think that's best, see, we are so polarized. We immediately, depending on who you talk to, tariffs are the best thing ever or tariffs are the worst thing ever. And the early Christians would have been like, listen, if we have them, if we don't have them, I'm here to serve. Whatever you think is best. Nick?
I think the tension there is either side has policies that are terrible. And the tension is you have to hold in tension, okay, I would say objective, not because, like you said, because I'm conservative, because I'm liberal. I would say objectively, tariffs are terrible economic policy. But the tension is well, they're the law. And if Paul is saying submit to the rule, I cannot like it, but I mean,
yeah.
That's just the
You have a
way.
question.
What's a tariff?
What's a tariff? I'm going to let your parents explain that to you later. Okay. No, not right this second. Hold the thought. Listen. Taxes, tariffs, respect. You know what? You're in charge. How can I be useful? How can we be, listen, how many churches have that attitude towards the government? How can we be useful? It's kind of rare. The last thing, honor. Yes, sir. It's so hard. Look, listen, I would have a really hard time with this. So I'm not sitting here going guys, you should all do this. It's really easy. I'm sitting here going, guys, this would be so hard for me to do. And yet Paul is saying we need to honor people as if God has put them in this position. So I'm actually going to pray for you regularly. I'm going to wish well for you. I want the best for you. Now listen, let's make some observations. That's what it means to be a public servant. No matter who is in office, we actually see them as God's agent for good or ill. Okay? And we're going to talk more about this in just a second. But we're here to serve. First of all, wow. If the church actually did that, we would be the best possible citizens. Okay? And this is what happened. Why did Christianity take over the Roman Empire? Because the early church actually did this. And the pagans were stunned by it. They said, these Christians aren't even, they're not just taking care of their own poor, they're taking care of the pagan poor as well. They're putting us to shame. They were incredible citizens. Number two, Paul is not saying that this is because the Roman Empire is better. It was actually probably worse. Number three, this attitude to me feels largely absent in the American church. And it feels largely absent in American Christians. And if I'm confessing, it's probably largely absent in me too. Okay? Last thing. If you had it, let me see my note. I'm trying to read my notes here. If you had this attitude, you could actually have churches that were engaged politically but not polarized. Meaning, think about how rare this is. To find a church that's politically engaged, but where you find both Republicans and Democrats in that same church. That is exceptionally rare in American Christianity. Okay? So what I'm getting at is this would actually be interesting if we could actually take the posture of a public servant. All right? Now, one other thing. That attitude is not to try to control the government, put our people in charge. It's actually to say we're here to serve the government no matter who God has put in charge. Left or right. Either side. We're going to be engaged but not polarized. Public servants. That's the first thing. Second thing. What's the underlying attitude towards authority here? This is really important. Paul is not a pro-government guy. You follow what I'm saying? Paul is not trying to Paul is not sitting there going, man, what we really need is a great government. Let me give you my vision for a good government. He is actually a pro-authority guy. And you see this in the text. What he's really talking about, he said, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those that resist will incur judgment. So what he's actually focused on, it's not so much like Paul loves government, okay? He's like, look, God has given governments. What he loves or what he appreciates is that governments fundamentally are authority structures. And Paul says it's really important for Christians to understand how to exist in an authority structure. A lot of people and a lot of American Christians would say, I don't have any problem with authority as long as it's my people that are in authority, okay, or in control. Or as long as I'm in control. But I think that's more American than Christian. The Bible's view on authority is that God puts people in authority, and this is really interesting and challenging. Sometimes he gives good kings, good leaders, okay? And when that happens, it can be a great blessing. It can be opportunities for justice, for equity, for peace. But sometimes God gives bad leaders. And the Bible's view is even the bad leaders were actually given or put there by God. And oftentimes it's to teach people some lessons. In other words, sometimes the Bible says, I think, okay, be careful what you ask for because God may give it to you in order to teach you that you didn't really want that in the first place. All right? Now, really important here, I'm not saying, look, it doesn't matter who's in power, therefore don't vote. We live in a country that's giving you the right to vote. By all means, use that right to vote, okay? Also, this does not mean blind obedience. Do whatever it says. The early Christians understood what submission meant. There's an aspect to submission that is both submissive, but at times stubborn. Okay? Follow me on this for a second. So the Roman government says to the early church, Christians, you all pay your taxes. And they all went, okay, we'll do it. The Romans are like, wow, that was easy. Okay, and then they say, Christians, I want you to take care of the poor people instead of the government. And the early church went, okay. Roman government's like, this is amazing. And then the government says something trivial like, by the way, we really don't want you to gather together. And the early Christians said, sorry. You're like, wait, we're just telling you, like, we don't care what you believe, but we don't want you to gather. Okay? The Roman government was really nervous about people getting together because maybe they're going to try to overthrow the government. That's what meetings are. All right? So you can't worship. They didn't care what you were worshiping. They were really just concerned about, are you going to overthrow the government? And the early Christians said, no, our worship is so important, we will get up before dawn on Sunday to like gather together in secret, even though it's illegal. Do you see how crazy that is? Now, why aren't they submitting? The answer is they're submitting to something higher. Okay? Another example. The Roman government said, listen, we caught you gathering together, all right, and you know we made a rule against that. So we're going to have to punish you, and we don't want to punish you because you guys are great. You pay your taxes, you help people out. You're really decent people. They're actually really admirable. Okay. However, we need you to demonstrate your loyalty to Rome, that you are politically loyal to the party. We just need you to say Caesar is Lord. And the early Christians were like, nope, Jesus is Lord. They're like, listen, you don't even need to, nobody really believes that Caesar is actually the Lord God. That's kind of this divine title. And the Christians are like, no, we're not even going to say it. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is actually ruling, not Caesar. Caesar's only there because Jesus graciously allowed Caesar to be there. Do you see what I'm saying? So how does that work together? Is that submission? And the Christians would say, we're actually submissive both to Caesar, but also to Jesus. And any time we have a commandment from Jesus or from God, okay, if Caesar's going to give us a different command, if it runs contrary to that, guess what? It's easy for us to choose. I'm with God rather than Caesar. So here's the thing. They have a nuanced view of authority, which says listen, this applies to our country today. Our political system right now, particularly the party that's in control right now, wants to say, I'm in control. I'm the ultimate authority. I can do whatever I want. And Christians need to be like, no, you're not. We're going to be submissive. We're going to be supportive. We are here to help. But guess what? We have a higher allegiance. This is exactly what you see in Jesus. Do you remember in Matthew chapter 22 where somebody comes to Jesus and says, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And what does he say? He says, what'd you say? Yeah, he says, give me a coin. And he's like, whose face is on the coin? Okay? And they're like, Caesar's. And he's like, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, but render to God what is God's. Do you hear that nuanced view of authority? There's another passage in Matthew chapter 8. Do you remember there was a centurion, a Roman soldier, commander, who comes to Jesus and he's got a sick servant back home. And he says, hey, I need you to heal my sick servant. And Jesus goes, oh, okay, I'll come to your house. And the centurion says, no, listen, you don't even need to come. Okay? I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. He's like, listen, this is not a big deal. I do not need you to come. Like, I'm not trying to make a thing. You can just say the word and he'll be healed. For I too am a man under authority. In other words, the Roman centurion who knows what it's like to be an authority over people, but he himself is under authority to Rome. He says that is exactly what Jesus is like. He is in authority over his disciples, but he is under authority to God. It's that, so if you're a disciple, well, this is not a good example because your allegiance, Jesus is never going to contradict God. But the point is, there's this balance where you are going to have earthly authorities and you are here to serve and to support and to help and to be a servant, but guess what? You have a higher allegiance. Now, listen. Is this your view of yourself under authority? If somebody said to you, who are you under authority to? Do you know what most American Christians would say? Nobody. Okay?
Literally, our whole country is built on that.
I know. It's like freedom. Okay? I should be able to do what I want, when I want. And we need to recognize that's a place where many of us are more American than we are Christian. Early Christians had this notion of I am here to submit to authority, but I serve a higher authority. Okay? If this is actually your view of yourself, do you know what would happen? Number one, you'll be able to submit to, well, let me say it this way. If you're ever in authority, you will probably be a much better leader because you know that you yourself answer to a higher authority. Okay? And if you're ever under somebody else's authority, you'll be able to submit even when they give you, like, I want you to go take out the trash. And they give you stupid commands, dumb commands, whatever. Maybe unwise commands, but they're not immoral. You're like, you know what? I can handle it. Or you'll be able to not submit when you shouldn't. When they say, I want you to lie, I want you to cheat, I want you to steal, I want you to do something wrong. You won't do the wrong things. You will be able to do the mundane things, the hard things. You will actually be a better leader and you'll be a better team player. Okay? This makes you even better citizens because you're not just submissive, but you're also not corruptible. Because you have a higher allegiance to a moral authority. You see yourself as answering to somebody bigger than yourself. Romans 4:12 says, each of us will give account of himself to God. Think about that. Do we actually go through life, through the day, through the week, thinking, I better pay attention to what I'm doing because I'm going to give account to God? All right? Hebrews 13:17 says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. In other words, everywhere in Scripture, anybody who is in authority, anybody who's under authority is like, I'm going to have to give an account. Anybody who is in authority is also going to have to give an account of how they shepherded and how they stewarded. So what's your attitude towards authority? Who are you in submission to? So the first one's government. Are you public servant? The second one is, are you actually somebody who's in submission to authority over you, but you have a higher allegiance to a higher authority? That's really important. Here's the last thing. What's your attitude towards work? What are you working for? This one's subtle, but it's important. When does authority or government go bad? And the answer is when the people who are in charge are fundamentally in it for themselves first. Okay? I feel like we're seeing a lot of that right now. It's probably always there, but it feels pretty brazen right now. In verse 3, he says, rulers are not a terror to those who practice good conduct. Okay? And I'm just going to say this briefly. Basically, Christians are called to work for the good, not their own good, first and foremost, but the good of the community, the good of the people, the good of culture. So Jeremiah 29, seek the shalom of the city where I have sent you in exile, for in its shalom you're going to find your shalom, your flourishing, your welfare. Okay? In other words, the Bible has this view that Christians are here not primarily to serve themselves, but to actually be servants. Who said something like that? Jesus! Make yourself a servant. Okay? And what you're working for is the flourishing and the shalom and the peace and the prosperity of others, even more than you are for yourself. Romans 12:18, previous chapter, says, as much as possible, live peaceably with all. Peaceably. In other words, seek the shalom of the people that God puts around you. First century Christians understood that they needed to be willing to forego their shalom for the sake of pursuing the shalom of others. Okay? What's in the best interest of all, even if it's costly for me. Because this is what Jesus did for us. He gave up his shalom, gave up his place with the Father, came down, poured himself out, okay, in order that we might be saved, reconciled to God, while we're still enemies. Most people, I think, are really working for their own shalom at the expense of others. In other words, I'll try to help other people, but if it's too costly to me, I'm going to choose my interests first. The Christians had a different view. Many of us want to be in authority rather than submit to other authority. We want the government to serve us rather than seeing ourselves as public servants. I think your views on government, authority, and what you're living for, what you're pursuing, actually shape the kind of community you're creating. Do you want to be somebody that no matter where you go starts to form this vibrant, life-giving gospel ethos? That's what the early Christians were. They saw it modeled in Jesus and they lived it out themselves. And how you think about government is going to impact how you live with other people. If you see government as primarily there to serve you or to force your opinions on others, guess what? You're going to look for the people around you to serve you, and you're going to try to get them to force your opinions on others. Okay? You're going to want to be an authority but you're not going to see yourself as under authority. You're going to work for yourself and your own shalom before you work for others. And you won't form lasting community. So if you want to create something that lasts, this is the way to do it. All right. Any questions? Because we got too many people. Yeah, Laura.
Okay. I feel like this passage is kind of problematic, and also you already addressed some of the problems about it. But like thinking about how Paul was executed by the government, Peter was executed by the government, Jesus was executed by the government, and like a lot of the early Christians also. Do you think that they're implying that we are supposed to just accept any judgment of the government, even to death? And we were kind of talking about last night about like leaving your country versus staying in your country if you have like oppression. Like, is it better to leave and if you're being oppressed, or to stay and try to, I don't know, change things, or just accept that as some sort of like noble action?
So this is a really good, there's a lot here. I'm just going to say a couple of things. These are good questions. We want to be really careful not to glorify martyrdom. And I actually think that's one, let's call it error, that maybe the early church didn't, but by the time you get to 300 AD, there were some Christians that were kind of like, they were almost like glorying in martyrdom because this shows my commitment. I don't think Paul's saying that. I also think Paul is not saying you can't resist. Like, if you look at Paul through the book of Acts, what you see is when he is like, he actually works the system. When he's about to be like handed over to the Jews, he's like, no, I'm a Roman citizen. I claim my right to stand trial in Rome. So there's definitely, I think, the opportunity, if the system gives you, like the system gives you the opportunity to vote. So if you don't like the people that are in power, you should absolutely vote against them or vote for somebody. Like, you have that freedom, utilize it. You have the freedom, and we still have this in our country, to resist. Now, we may need to be willing to accept the consequences if we do that. But I think there's a way, let me say it this way. Martin Luther King was an excellent example of somebody who resisted peacefully. Civil disobedience. He's like, I'm gonna submittingly resist, or resistingly submit. So I'm not saying that we can't do that. And I'm also not saying that like our government will allow you to leave and go someplace else if you don't like it here. So I'm not saying, no, you have to stay. I think we have a lot of freedom and a lot of liberty in how we pursue that. Like, Paul himself doesn't just take it, he works it, but he's also not afraid of the outcome. And we live in a culture that's really afraid of death. And the early Christians really had a strong view that death is not the worst thing that can happen to me. Being separated from God, judgment, what comes after death, hell, those are the worst things. So there's kind of a reordering of that. Allison.
I think one of the ways I've had a lot of these conversations, and one of the ways that I kind of made it work within my personal life is, if we believe we're each individually called to do something, then our individual answer will be different. Some will stay and some will leave.
Yeah.
And so that has to do with us knowing who we are and who our purpose is and what we're called to do.
This gets back, yeah, this gets back to the idea of there's not a one size fits all. This is why it was at the very end, where was it? where was the passage? Right at the end of it's verse 3 of chapter 12. That by testing, why do we need the renewing of our mind? So that by testing you may discern the will of God, what is perfect and acceptable, and what is good and acceptable and perfect. The point is, and this is I think the brilliance, Paul doesn't try to say, here's how everybody should do this, but he says everybody should practice this, and all of us should practice it as if we're going to someday give account for what we did. And therefore, I need to be prepared to answer God and say, here's what my thinking was. Yeah.
One of the things that I wrote down about in this was I think Paul can actually exist in this authority structure because he actually has a solid view on what God's sovereignty and what our limited sovereignty has, right? And so that means that when God is sovereign, God had, like, we have to believe that God planned and knew that all of our, New Testament people were going to die via martyrdom, right? And that we have to be able to accept, you're talking about the consequences, but that God's sovereignty, and that's the way that God actually works, is that we don't understand, and we want to avoid pain, and we want to avoid suffering, but like, that's not the reality. It might be fatalistic, but that's the reality of the world that we live in.
You have to have, this is a great point, I failed to mention this, you have to have, in order to live this way, you have to believe that God really is sovereign over everything. In order to actually entrust yourself to sometimes unjust leaders. And you also have to believe that God speaks and that he's going to guide you and direct you and not just leave you alone. So let's, real quick, I want to go to the Lord's Supper. Can you do it in 1 minute, Nick?
Oh yeah, all I was going to say is I was in this passage last August, and what I had written down is that this is very convicting for me because it's easy for me to look at people in positions of authority, whether at my job or in government, as like the Pharisee did the tax collector, where I'm like, well, thank you, Lord, that I'm not like this person who works for the government, whereas you're saying, like, no, I actually have to see myself as somebody who works for the government.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, it's tough. Brutal.
Serve at the pleasure
Okay.
of the president.
I serve at the pleasure.
Yeah.
Man. Okay. I'm going to wash my hands. We're going to come to the Lord's Supper.